Welcome to week 10 of SWK 700, Human Behavior and the Social Environment. This is your professor, Dr. Yvonne Ruiz, and the topic for this week is solution-focused and narrative approaches. The material in this screencast comes mainly from Malcolm Payne, Modern Social Work Theory. Let's begin. I want to start with a quote by Steve DeShazer, who is an expert on solution-focused approaches, and he says, problem talk creates problems. Solution talk creates solutions. As you know, this is very important for us as social workers, as clients come to us looking for positive outcomes to the difficulties they're facing in their lives. So what is the solution-focused approach? Solutions to one's problems are typically found in the exceptions to the problem. And what this means is that the times when the client is not actively experiencing a problem, when the problem is not present in the client's life, that is the exception. And by exploring and identifying the times when the problem is not present, that holds the key to finding solutions. So, for example, if a client is struggling with excruciating shyness, but typically has no trouble speaking to his or her coworkers, a solution-focused therapist would target the workplace as an exception to the client's usual shyness in social situations. So the exception is where the client works, and looking at why he or she doesn't experience shyness in that situation can help to find solutions for when the client does feel shy. The social worker therapist helps the client formulate a solution-based treatment plan on what sets the exception scenario apart, what makes the exception an important example of how the problem can be solved. And this aids the client in setting goals and implementing solution-focused approaches. Collaborative approaches are key. So this type of therapy or this type of intervention relies heavily on the therapist and the client working together. The therapist is not the expert. The therapist does not provide a lot of advice or solution or guidance. Rather, it comes from the collaboration between the therapist and the client. Solution-focused works on the assumption that every individual has at least some level of motivation, some energy to address their problem or problems and find solutions that can improve their quality of life. So this is very closely related to the strengths perspective, where we want to find those resources and the strengths that exist in the times where there is an exception to the problem and build on that to find solutions. This motivation on the part of the client is an essential piece. So, helping the client to make changes that they want and that are needed also means that the client has to want this. The client has to put their time and attention and effort into making this type of intervention work. And there is the collaboration between the therapist and the client. So what are the practitioner skills that facilitate solution-based approaches? 1, you ask questions. You come from a place of curiosity and gathering information, open-ended questions, rather than giving your client the answers. Number 2, you notice, you pay attention, and reinforce evidence of the client's positive qualities, strengths, resources, and especially their competence to solve their own problems. Here is the strengths-based approach. Third, you work with what people can do rather than focusing on what they can't do. So you're identifying their skills and abilities and talents to help in finding a solution and managing their difficulties. Number 4, you pinpoint the behaviors a client is already engaging in that are helpful and effective, and you find ways to facilitate problem solving through these behaviors. So you also need to be very specific and clear. So here is where a CBT perspective can also be very helpful. Number 5, you focus on the details of the solution instead of the problem. It's almost as if you assume that the problem is already solved. So you're focusing on that aspect rather than delving deep into the problem. And finally, you develop action plans that work for the client. Again, this is done collaboratively. It has to make sense for the client in order for the client to be motivated to make those changes. That was a pretty quick overview of solution-focused approaches. I'm going to move into narrative therapy now. They're both related in that they both rely on the client's report of what is happening in their lives. The difference with narrative therapy is that you're aiming to get a complete and very detailed story of the whole of the client's life and not just on the problem issue. So the origins of narrative therapy lie with Michael White and David Epstein, and they used narrative approaches as a therapeutic tool in their work in family therapy. And the idea is that narratives provide meaning and coherence in people's lives. The stories that we tell ourselves is part of the meaning that we make in our life. So stories have the potential to empower clients and help them gain control over their lives. So here are some assumptions on the narrative approach. Narrative theory is based on the premise that all people are engaged in constructing a life story or their own personal narrative that determines their understanding of themselves and their position in their life and their position in the world. Narrative therapy provides opportunities for growth and development. It provides ways to find meaning and a pathway to better understanding of ourselves, and I would add, of the issues that we face in our lives. And the goal is to help the client, which can include the family, to transform their narrative, to transform their life story, to re-story their life, and that enables an expansion of their possibilities and understanding of who they are. As a narrative therapist, your main skill is to facilitate therapeutic conversations that elicit the client's perspective and how they make meaning of their life story. So there's an emphasis on language, an emphasis on creating a story, and an emphasis that really comes from the social construction theory that we've already discussed about. You demonstrate openness, empathy, care, curiosity, interest, respect, and collaboration. So you're working from a place where you are connected, engaged, authentic, and you provide unconditional support and non-judgment. And that should remind you of the humanistic approach. So to adopt a not knowing attitude, we do not make assumptions about what's happening. We do not aim to find or give solutions. Rather, you're helping the client to unfold the narrative and meaning making that already exists within them. You engage with the client's story through active listening, normalizing, reflecting, and helping the client to think analytically about their story. And the aim is to reconstruct an alternate life story. And it's not about making things up. That's not the point. The point is to see things from a different perspective. The point maybe is to use some cognitive reframing and to think about and reflect on the impact of events in the client's life, and then to find new possibilities and celebrate them. So Payne identifies 4 practice ideas. The first is the practice of deconstruction, and this means taking apart, sometimes referred to as unpacking, the client's story through analyzing the individual elements and exploring power dynamics. So you're helping the client to identify themes in their life story, and you're deconstructing and analyzing those themes and reflecting on them. And this helps to identify and integrate multiple perspectives in order to open up possibilities. It's also a practice of discourse. And discourse means that you take a deep dive to explore the situation through examining language and multiple positions in order to gain more understanding. Again, analysis and reflection and the use of language are key in creating this discourse. And the discourse happens in the space where you're interacting, where the client and therapist are interacting. You find exceptions, as was already discussed in the solution-focused approach. You find those successful behaviors, those joyful events, those gratifying relationships, and emphasize those to help the client to manage and overcome their barriers and or problems. And finally, one of the main practice methods is the miracle question. The miracle question helps clients to identify their goals and objectives by asking the client, for example, what would your life look like if one night you went to bed and a miracle occurred while you were sleeping and you woke up the next morning after the miracle has occurred in your life? What would your life look like? That's one example of a miracle question. You can phrase it in many different ways, and you can tailor it specifically to what is going on with your client. The narrative process has 4 distinct stages, and each stage may take time to develop, and the worker uses a variety of skills at each stage of the process. So the first is the stage where your client is developing and telling and reporting their personal narrative. And this is where you would encourage the client to communicate, to express whatever is going on, to describe and to explore his or her narrative in as full a fashion as possible, to really dive into the personal narrative and really understand the client's story. The second stage is deconstruction. That's where you help your client reflect and analyze on their story, to look at the underlying assumptions, their sources of knowledge, social and cultural forces that have shaped their story, and the client's perception of the events. And all of that is in the service of separating the client's story from larger oppression, discrimination, perhaps ways that the client doesn't own their story, but that is owned by others. So everything that has contributed to the problem situation is deconstructed and analyzed. And the point is that the client can own their own story, that the client is able then to move into the next stage, which is the reconstruction of their story, or referred to as reauthoring or restoring a new alternative personal narrative that is more supportive and empowering of the new sense of self. And their sense of self is impacted by telling their story and examining it closely and then looking at it from another perspective, so that the client can own their story in a way that is more empowering, reclaiming their life, if you will, owning and being accountable for what they've experienced. So, and this process is one that is about building on the facts, building on what has actually happened, and not making things up or telling themselves a lie, but rather confronting what has happened, dealing with the feelings and behaviors that have occurred that have been problematic, and then reauthoring their story in a way that reclaims their power. And finally, celebration and connection. And this process refers to the client's reconnection with others and with themselves in the acknowledgement and celebration of the reauthored narrative. This is where you as the worker might engage in some type of event or ritual or reflection on how the client's new story or reauthored story presents new possibilities. So this approach focuses on the use of language and communication and expression. That is very important and is a basic skill for the worker to encourage and facilitate your client. So questions are used as a way to generate experience, not necessarily to gather information. So what I mean by generating experience is helping the client to retell their life story. You're not using your own questions as you might in a biopsychosocial, but rather you are focusing on what the client is telling you and using follow-up questions and open-ended questions to engage in further meaning making. This approach is based on not knowing. You can't make any assumptions, can't have any judgments. It's really about approaching your client with an open mind, and as a learner, you're learning about your client from your client's story, and you're encouraging them to tell their story in as a descriptive and full manner as possible. So your questions are designed to assist your client in exploring their story, in identifying the dimensions of their lives, in identifying themes and experiences and patterns that come up repeatedly in their life story. And questions lead to deconstructing the problem-saturated stories that clients often bring to us. And what problem-saturated means is that when clients come to us with difficulties, with barriers, with challenges, with problems, their stories are all about the problem. So part of our work is to help our clients separate the problem from their larger life story, because clients aren't only their problem, right? Clients also have humanity. Their lives are filled with many people, events, and other aspects of their lives. So reclaiming all of the aspects of a client's life is part of the narrative process. So one of the techniques of questioning is the use of externalizing questions. Externalization is the central therapeutic technique that's used, and White and Empstone talk extensively about externalizing questions, and they're designed to help clients to begin to identify and define their problems as separate from your client's identity, from the core of who your client sees themselves, his or her, to actually be, as not being fully identified with the problem, but identifying other aspects of who they are. So identifies problems that have been internalized as part of their self and has become closely intertwined with their sense of self and identity. So externalizing questions aim to locate the problem outside of the individual, so that then you can look at the problem and examine it as something that can be managed and coped with, and finding solutions, rather than your client being the problem. The problem is the problem. It's not an inherent characteristic of the individual. It's not part of your client's personality, in other words. So problems are located as products of culture and history. Think about that for a moment, and think about how we've talked about the importance of social context. And this is where the environmental factors, relationships, about sources of oppression, sources of discrimination, and the ways that these forces are internalized in ways that are negative and have deleterious impacts on our client need to be acknowledged. So narratives are a client's story, but part of what we do is connect your client's story with larger social issues and larger social and cultural forces that also shape our lives. So you're helping the client to see from a broader perspective. And finally, externalizing questions enable the client to begin to revise their relationship with the problem. Rather than being the problem is the problem. Another type of question are deconstruction questions, or deconstructing questions. Deconstruction, as we've already talked about, refers to breaking down the problem or problems, usually more than one, the client is having. And it makes it easier to understand and address the problems when you're breaking them down into smaller parts or components. So you're understanding all of the elements that contribute to the problems. So deconstructing unpacks, and this technique helps the client to dig deep into the problem, to make it more manageable and to better understand the impact. Makes the problems more specific and more identifiable. Also avoids overgeneralizing, which is an error in thinking. And deconstructing also helps to clarify the issue or the issues so that you can actually talk about them and be more specific. Finally, important features of both solution-focused and narrative practice, and hopefully by this point in the screencast you can see where both of these approaches connect. They are distinct, but they're also related to each other. And what they have in common is that both of these approaches draw out people's own narratives and incorporates their own understanding of their lives and their objectives in working with the practitioner. Maintaining a positive focus on the desired outcomes is a focus of both of these approaches. They're optimistic, they're hopeful, they build on strengths, and they believe in the client's ability to improve their lives. They both use techniques that maintain the client's future and forward-looking perspective, that their problems can change, that their lives will get better, and focus on the positive outcomes that they're looking to achieve. They both work to identify the client's strengths, both internal and external. They identify positive exceptions to the client's problems. They identify positive exceptions to dysfunctional patterns. And then those exceptions can be amplified and used to develop client strengths and resources and find ways of overcoming those barriers. And finally, looking for clients' own solutions. So this helps the client's own motivation to change by getting them to observe the successes in their life and toward maintaining a forward emphasis and working actively with clients to identify solutions and strengths. So this concludes the screencast on solution-focused and narrative practice. Thank you for listening this far.